Chapter 240, Lehane 11. Exid was an extravagant magic armor unique to the kingdom of Shimuan, crafted from orichalcon. Although Eugene had seen Dior and Princess Scalia wearing Exid in the snowfield, the one that the commander of the Violent Tide Knights adorned was truly befitting his status. Ortis Exid was quite different from the armor that the two had been wearing. A large engraving caught Eugene's attention, situated in the center of Ortis' chest plate. The emblem symbolized the Violent Tide Knights, characterized by swirling waves and a whirlpool. Unlike Princess Scalia's armor, the royal family's symbol was not engraved on Ortis' armor. However, Eugene noticed something far more precious at the vortex's center, a red jewel the size of a thumb. But it wasn't as if Eugene had recognized it because he was keen. Rather, the jewel's fame was undeniable as well as Ortis' armor. The revelation that the jewel was, in fact, a dragon heart was nothing short of astounding. Despite not being fashioned from an entire dragon heart like the renowned artifacts Vladimir or Akasha, it still contained the essence of the legendary creature, making it an object of immense power and mythical significance. Naturally, Ortis cherished his Exid, recognizing it as an invaluable treasure. Yet he knew that it was not his to claim alone. Instead, it was one of the national treasures of Shimuan, a source of pride and strength for their people. In addition to the prized armor, there were numerous weapons and Exids crafted using parts of the dragon heart. The dragon heart was a sacred artifact with a storied past. Its origins were tied to the sea dragon, the fabled protector of the South Sea and Shimuan. For many years, the sea dragon had kept watch over the nation and the sea, defending it against all manner of threats. However, in the epic battle against the demon kings that had taken place 3 centuries ago, the creature had sustained mortal injuries. Despite his incredible power, the sea dragon had ultimately been unable to overcome the overwhelming forces arrayed against him. His last act had been to return to the sea he had guarded for so long before passing away. In his wake, he left behind his remains, including the precious dragon heart, as a gift to the royal family of Shimuan. Dragon bones, scales and heart, albeit only a fragment, were said to be used in crafting this armor. It was reputed to be the finest armor in the entire continent, and its looks certainly live up to its reputation, Eugene concluded. Eugene was filled with awe as he gazed upon the armor up close for the first time. He couldn't help but imagine the immense strength a skilled knight would possess if they were to wear such a magnificent suit of armor. Of course, that wasn't to say that Ortis didn't deserve such a magnificent suit of armor. Although Eugene couldn't be entirely certain until they crossed blades, from the atmosphere he exuded, Ortis seemed strong enough to be called one of the best knights of the continent. Ortis asked, "Are you attempting to gauge my abilities?" Despite his tall height, Ortis had a lean build that exuded a sense of precision and sharpness, like a finely crafted blade. His hair was neatly parted down the middle, his complexion was fair, and there were noticeable dark circles under his eyes. Apart from his skills, he looked rather depressed. Eugene quickly apologized, saying, "I'm sorry if I came across as disrespectful. It wasn't my intention. I suppose it was an instinctive reaction to being in the presence of the renowned Sir Ortis Hyman." "Not at all. It's only natural for someone to be judged when they are well known. So what is your opinion of me?" Ortis asked. "I don't know. I think I would have a better idea after crossing swords than from someone's first impression," said Eugene. "That sounds like a provocation. Don't get me wrong. I'm not offended. I felt it yesterday too, but this just seems like your personality," responded Ortis with a straight face. Was he truly not offended? Eugene stared Ortis straight in the face. "Oh, you must have been surprised since I came so suddenly," commented Ortis. "Honestly, yes," answered Eugene. "I understand that my son and Princess Scalia were indebted to you." Eugene remembered what he had learned from Cyan and Seal. It was entirely due to the mischievous actions of the Queen of the Night Demons that Princess Scalia was in a confused state and rampaged. Unfortunately, they couldn't inform Scalia of this fact. Eugene knew he could let the matter slide, but it was a different matter for Scalia. As a princess of Shimuan, if she labeled Morgiabella's prank as an ambush, it could become a major nuisance. Cyan and Seal had spent considerable time pondering how to explain the situation to Princess Scalia. However, to their relief, they didn't have to come up with an excuse. Upon waking up, Princess Scalia and Dior convinced themselves that they had been poisoned during their pursuit of the Black Dog mercenaries. The poison had caused them to experience a temporary state of delirium and rage, likely of a magical nature. Luckily, their exits had neutralized the poison after a while, but in the interim, they had briefly lost their minds and attacked Eugene's group. Ultimately, they were overpowered and lost consciousness. The truth behind the incident with Princess Scalia and Dior was quite different from what they believed. In fact, their delusion was a trick of Noir Giabella, who had used her hypnosis to manipulate their memories. With her demon eye of fantasy, she could easily manipulate the human mind and make them believe anything she wanted. Thanks to her abilities, Princess Scalia and Dior didn't even remember meeting Eugene. Despite the strange turn of events, Eugene was relieved that he didn't have to devise an excuse for their behavior. I heard from the princess and my son that they were subdued without being injured whilst in their delirium thanks to your talents, said Ortis. Eugene quickly came up with an excuse. Well, it could have been due to their confusion, but I don't think they were able to display their true capabilities. Ortis didn't seem to buy Eugene's attempt to downplay his skills in subduing Princess Scalia and Dior. You don't have to try to protect my son's pride, he said. I saw the fight yesterday. Even if Dior was in his right mind and giving it his all, he wouldn't have been able to beat you even if there were 10 of him. Ortis spoke swiftly. Eugene noticed a fleeting crease between Ortis' eyebrows when he mentioned his son's name. Eugene was no strange to this expression. I guess all extreme parents are similar. Tanis had worn a similar expression when she talked about Uid. Eugene had a rough idea of the situation with Dior, but he couldn't help feeling curious. Even if Ortis was talking about his own son, he seemed to extremely undervalue Dior. However, Eugene knew that Dior was no slouch. He had managed to receive Princess Scalia's sword and, while not on par with Eugene, was still a talented individual in his own right. Or is his father's standards just too high? Eugene couldn't help but wonder if Ortis had set the bar too high for his son. Dior was only 2 years older than Eugene, and while age didn't necessarily equate to strength, it was possible that Ortis had placed high expectations on his son to become a knight who could represent their country. Let's stop talking about my lacking son, said Ortis, even though he had been the one to bring up the topic. Regarding the accident with Princess Scalia and my son, I did not report it to His Majesty. Princess Scalia did not want it either. When Noir Giabella had possessed Princess Scalia, she had talked with Eugene using Scalia as a medium. Princess Scalia was the vice-commander of the Violent Tide Knights, known as the Princess Knight, and she was considered to be one of the symbols of Shimyuan, the Kingdom of Knights. Scalia had realized early on that her skills were inadequate to represent the Kingdom of Knights. Despite this realization, she pushed herself to the limits, training tirelessly and striving to meet the expectations of those around her. However, a sense of despair gradually crept into her heart when she failed to see any significant improvement. It was this weakness that Noir Giabella was able to exploit, and she easily gained control over Scalia. That's why night demons were so horrible. If one had darkness in their heart and wasn't satisfied with their reality, they would naturally fall into a dream. Night demons invaded their dreams and laced them with malice and greed. Acting on her own accord, Princess Scalia had made the decision to eliminate the Black Dog mercenaries, and Dior had no choice but to follow as her subordinate. Her brutal tactics in killing them had been a release for the anger and stress that had built up inside her over time. The cause of this stress was her fear of insomnia, which prevented her from getting any rest at night, leading to a natural inclination towards cruelty. Everything had been fine until then. However, things took a different turn when Scalia's identity was brought into the mix. As the vice-commander of the Violent Tide Knights, an organization renowned as one of the strongest on the continent, how could it be that the Princess Knight had been poisoned during a mission to kill mercenaries, lost control of herself, and ended up indiscriminately swinging her sword? If this incident was exposed to the public, it would bring immense shame to her, the knights, and the Kingdom of Shimyuan. Therefore, it was natural for Princess Scalia to want to cover it up and Ortis to want to investigate the matter after allowing her unexpected actions. I understand what you are asking, Sir Ortis. However, I split up with Princess Scalia in the middle of our journey, said Eugene. I heard from the Lionheart's twins that the princess asked for their understanding already. And if I ask you once again, won't you relay to them what I've told you as well? responded Ortis before glancing outside the walls. A small army of monsters was persisting against a group of knights. Ortis clicked his tongue while looking at the scene with disapproving eyes. Even if you gather a bunch of rabbits, they'll still be rabbits. What? Said Eugene. You should already know. The knights fighting over there are the Guardian Knights of the Anti-Demon Alliance. They're a group made up of knights who have earned some reputation in their respective small countries. Though they may number many, only a handful are truly skilled, said Ortis before pointing his finger at one of the knights. Do you see that man standing over there? Regulus, the commander of the Guardian Knights. What do you think about his skills? I assure you that he couldn't be confident in overwhelming any of the knights belonging to the White Lion Knights. Well, honestly, I don't see why you're hesitant. The White Lion Knights are a prestigious group that's recognized all across the continent. Skilled knights from every corner of the world aspire to join our ranks. But what about the Guardian Knights? Their skills are meager at best. They may seem impressive in their small nations, but they're nothing more than a hodgepodge of mediocre knights. Ortis' disdainful words hung in the air, and Eugene remained silent, taking in his words. After a moment, Ortis cleared his throat and continued, his expression softening slightly. I've shown you a disgraceful appearance. I hope you understand. It's not like I dislike them as knights. However, I am annoyed by their crudity. What do you mean by crudity? Asked Eugene. Ortis asked a question in response. What is the reason to hold this night march? Why did I come to this northernmost land from the warm south with the violent Tide Knights and His Majesty the King? Is it not because the Anti-Demon Alliance tried to show off what little power it had at Helmuth's border? Indeed. Eugene nodded. Ortis wasn't wrong at all, and the Demon King of Incarceration had also warned about this very thing. However, the responsibility could not be placed entirely on the Anti-Demon Alliance. The Anti-Demon Alliance had acted so boldly because the Paladins of Eurus had always acted with the Guardian Knights. For a long time, they remained stationed near Helmuth's border, calling for the conquest of Helmuth and the death of the Demon Kings. What makes me dislike them even more is that even though we've gone through the trouble of gathering here because of them, they aren't showing any remorse at all. They are weak but shameless as well. I despise that. And once the night march ends, they will bite back the troops stationed near the border as if nothing ever happened, hiding behind the Holy Empire. I understand the reason since the Anti-Demon Alliance is practically a tributary to the Holy Empire, but that doesn't change my contempt for them, explained Ortis. Is that so? Eugene played along. Ortis seemed incredibly proud, perhaps because he was the representative figure from the Kingdom of Knights. I don't like these types. Eugene clicked his tongue mentally. Since his past life, Eugene had never harbored any fondness for those knights who acted condescendingly. So he took on a crooked tone in his next question. Did you come to me to talk about strong and excellent knights? Ortis stared at Eugene in silence for a moment, then shook his head. I came here to make a proposal. What is it? Asked Eugene. I'm sure you know this already, but the participants of the Night March are concealing various goals derived from self-interest apart from its original purpose. Of course, I don't mean to disparage the original goal of the Night March. The Demon King of Incarceration came for a visit, and Sir Molan Roar, the great hero, is currently staying in this fortress, said Ortis while turning his gaze toward the castle. Sir Molan is currently speaking with the knights of the Lionheart family, but during the Night March, knights from other nations will also have their chances. The leaders of the continent will also discuss the future of the world with Sir Molan as well. I believe the training will be fruitless, but there is value in discovering the will of the Demon King of Incarceration and conversing with Sir Molan. Ortis paused for a moment, then continued. Let me cut to the chase. My goal here was to propose that you come to Shimuan. You don't seem to have any intention of doing so now, responded Eugene. If you had not been chosen by the Holy Sword, I would have promised you many things as the envoy of His Majesty the King. No, even without me having to do so, His Majesty would have stepped up personally, said Ortis. This was nothing new for Eugene. During his time in Arath, Eugene had received a similar proposal from Honian Abram, the Crown Prince of Arath, and Tremple Vizardo, commander of Aratha's court wizards. As the adopted son of the head of the Lionheart family, it was impossible for Eugene to succeed as the next head, especially in a family that placed great emphasis on legitimacy. Nevertheless, Eugene had all the qualities and abilities necessary to lead the family with distinction. Because of this, some who were unfamiliar with him assumed that he was unhappy with his current position and offered him attractive incentives to renounce his affiliation with the Lionheart family. Since you were chosen by the Holy Sword, I don't think the riches we can offer you would interest you greatly. So I want to make another proposal. No, rather, I think it would be more appropriate to call it a request instead, asked Ortis. And what would that be? Said Eugene. The Abyssal Princess Iris, answered Ortis with a frown. I think this name should be familiar. You're not suggesting that Iris turned to piracy because Lady Carmen and I failed to eliminate her back then, are you? Retorted Eugene, his expression turning into a scowl. Eugene had respected Ortis thus far, but if he continued to spout such nonsense, he would quickly lose any shred of respect he had left. Would I say such a shameless thing? Said Ortis. Fortunately, he wasn't a shameless bastard. He shook his head violently, genuinely flustered by Eugene's accusation. It is no one's responsibility that the Abyssal Princess escaped from Kiel. Although she doesn't compare to the likes of the Blade of Incarceration, the Queen of the Night Demons or the Black Dragon, she is still one of the monsters who survived the war from 300 years ago. Well, yes, even though she's resorted to shabby pirating now, said Eugene. It's not shabby. Ortis' frown deepened a notch. She's a powerful monster. The sea is wide and there are many pirates, but she managed to gain control over most of the pirates in the South Sea in just 1 year. At first she only had a single shabby pirate ship, but now she has dozens of pirate organizations under her wing. They call themselves the Pirates of Fury. Was it really to that extent? Eugene was left in a state of bewilderment as he gazed at Ortis. Ortis went on to explain, as she gained more power, the Abyssal Princess became more daring in her piracy. She began to target larger merchant groups and took over numerous trade ships. It's become a significant problem. We've tried sending multiple expeditions to stop her, but it's been futile. Her demon eye allows her to easily evade us. As someone who's faced her before, I can tell you she's running away when she doesn't need to. If the Rakshasa Princess decided to face off against the expedition, the entire fleet would have been buried at the bottom of the ocean, said Eugene. I think so too. I don't think the Abyssal Princess wants to openly become hostile with the kingdom of Shimuan. Has she not already done that by attacking the merchants and the trading ships? Asked Eugene. Ortis replied with a contemplative expression. Not necessarily. The Abyssal Princess has shown flexibility in her actions. While she does attack and occupy ships, she doesn't plunder everything. She takes a hefty toll and often lets the ships go. Only in the case of elves being transported as slaves would she rob them. This kind of behavior is not uncommon among powerful pirates in the South Sea. It's considered customary. I know a bit. They take tolls and offer some of it as bribes. Isn't that right? To be honest, the royal family must also be receiving the Rakshasa Princess bribes, said Eugene. Ortis was speechless. After glaring at Eugene for a moment, he nodded with a long sigh. You are right. Even before she became as powerful as she is now, she bribed the higher-ups of the navy. Of course, even greater riches ended up in the hands of the royal family. In addition to imposing taxes and tariffs on the goods transported by the trade ships, they took bribes as well. It was a cruel and heart-wrenching reality for the victims of these attacks, but those accepting the bribes turned a blind eye to their suffering. But the Abyssal Princess wasn't left unattended just for the sake of the bribes. She is strong and there's nothing we can do about her with the forces of Shimuan. Moreover, the sea is wide and there are many pirates. We thought that she might be able to maintain control of the pirates if she succeeded in uniting them, explained Ortis. Was that truly the whole story? Eugene didn't buy it. He wasn't naive and could see the possibility that Shimuan may have wanted to harness the power of the Abyssal Princess for their own gain. It was possible that they had allowed her piracy and bribery as a means of indirect power and to establish a trading relationship with her. Iris, the Rakshasa Princess, also known as the Abyssal Princess, was certainly a power to be greedy for. She had already turned her back on Helmuth after losing her territory to Noir Giabella. So Shimuan would have wanted to coax the Abyssal Princess into fostering a relationship with them so the royal family could have her act on their requests. It must not have worked out. Well, of course. That madwoman is hoping for the revival of the Dark Elves and the resurrection of the Demon King of Fury. Thinking so, Eugene asked, "So, what happened that ruined the friendly relationship between Shimuan and the Rakshasa princess?" "That monster has grown out of proportion," responded Ortis. "She must have started to cut down on the bribes," said Eugene. "Let's stop talking about the bribes. It won't do any good for anyone else to hear about it," said Ortis. "So why are you telling me all this?" asked Eugene. "Didn't I tell you already? I want to ask you for a favor." Ortis started to become a little irritated with Eugene continuing to tease him. "You are the hero who has been chosen by the Holy Sword. Also, isn't the Abyssal Princess your enemy? So I would like to ask for your help until we take down the Abyssal Princess." "The hero is not a volunteer," stated Eugene. "What do you mean?" asked Ortis. "It is entirely in your liberty to ask me for help. However, I am saying that there is no reason for me to agree to your request unconditionally, all but for the sake of burning justice," responded Eugene. "Even at this moment, the Abyssal Princess is performing evil deeds while throwing the sea into chaos," said Ortis. "Wasn't it Shimuan that allowed the crazy woman to roam free without attempting to catch her earlier?" asked Eugene. "I know that we have a responsibility. So I will be joining the conquest for the Abyssal Princess. His Majesty has also expressed his intention of bringing the elite of the Violent Tide Knights and the proud navy of Shimuan will. We won't need an entire fleet for this operation. If need be, I could cross the ocean with a single small boat. If I had the power, I could kill the Abyssal Princess alone without being accompanied by the Violent Tide Knights," Eugene cut in. Ortis' lips twitched upon hearing Eugene's answer. "Are you saying that you possess such power? Even I am not confident that I could face the Abyssal Princess." "That's not necessarily what I'm getting at, but anyways, I understand what you wanted to say," said Eugene. Then, "I understand, but that doesn't mean I will do it. I told you, didn't I? The hero doesn't volunteer," said Eugene, punctuating his words by raising his finger in front of his chest. He formed a circle by joining his index finger and thumb, causing Ortis to feel a shiver down his spine. What was that vulgar and materialistic gesture? Then it dawned on him that Eugene was the same person who had flipped off the Demon King of Incarceration just yesterday. Well, exactly how much would you like?" asked Ortis. "I know I made a coin with my fingers, but I already have a lot of money, so I have no need for more." "What about an exit?" said Eugene. "That we can. One with a dragon heart. As far as I know, there are 2 more exits embedded with the dragon heart in the treasury of Shimuan," Eugene interrupted. "That's," cried Ortis. Then he took a look around before composing himself. "Is the national treasure of Shimwim. We cannot hand it out to a foreigner. Then I'll just borrow it for about 50 years and return it afterward. If you decline, then there's no helping it. If the Rakshasa princess brings her fleet and ends up attacking Shimuan, maybe, just maybe, she will take down the capital and the castle, open up the treasury, and claim the precious treasures as her own." "I'm very worried indeed," teased Eugene with a look of sincere regret. Ortis ground his teeth without realizing it. Even a toddler could know that Eugene was mocking him. The valley between Ortis' eyebrows deepened and his clenched fists started to tremble. He had many things he wanted to say, but he couldn't possibly allow them to escape through his lips. Ortis couldn't deny that he needed Eugene's help. The Abyssal Princess, Iris, was a formidable opponent, a hybrid with a direct lineage to the Demon King of Fury and a pure-blooded dark elf. He knew he would require the Holy Sword to stand a chance against such a monster. Additionally, if he managed to convince Eugene to join him, Christina Rogerus would follow suit. It was a gamble, but Ortis had no other choice. He took a deep breath and tried to compose himself. "I understand your request. Very well. I will discuss it with His Majesty," said Ortis. "If 50 years is too long, I'm willing to go for half. Let's say 25 years. Let me speak with His Majesty. We can negotiate afterward," spat Ortis. "I don't intend to go for anything less than 25 years, so there won't be a need for a negotiation," said Eugene. Ortis could no longer stand it. He jerked around, then jumped down from the wall without saying anything. "Oh, this feels so good." Eugene smiled in satisfaction. He waved at Ortis as he grew farther and farther away, emitting a fierce momentum. Chapter 241. The Brave Molin 1. 4 days had passed since their meeting, but Orthros still had yet to revisit Eugene. "It seems that they aren't in any hurry yet," Eugene mused. Perhaps it would be less of a shocking offer to shorten the 50 years to just 25? Eugene also had the intention of one day finding Iris, who was sailing around the southern seas, and killing her. However, honestly speaking, that was far down on his list of priorities. The very first thing that Eugene needed to do was to visit Helmuth's dragon demon castle. He would find Raizakia's hatching there, and if it was possible he would kill it. Of course, before that he would use the hatchling to find Raizakia in the gap between dimensions. Iris and any other unfinished business would come after that. Judging from how Orthrus had phrased his request, it seemed that the Shimuan side still thought of Iris as just a nuisance, and hadn't yet decided to take care of her as soon as possible. Also, the biggest problem with capturing Iris was that the seas were just too wide. In addition to that, Iris' demon Eye of Darkness was formidable not only in combat, but also when it came to fleeing. In the middle of those wide open seas, what were they supposed to do if Iris used the demon Eye of Darkness to escape? Not only Eugene but any other wizard in the world wouldn't be able to stop Iris from leaving. Well, compared to Noor Giabella, Iris is pretty crazy, Eugene thought idly as he brushed the snow off his cheek. 2 days before, Molen had suddenly left the fort. Leaving behind the words, "I'll be back," on the wall of a hallway, the idiot had left without saying anything to Eugene or Anise. Out of the blue, he had just suddenly disappeared in the middle of the night. They could guess the reason for this. What other reason could Molen have for suddenly disappearing? Wasn't it obvious? In Lehanjar, beyond the Great Hammer Canyon, the Nur had probably reappeared. Idiot, Eugene grumbled as he thought of Molen. After arriving at the fort, Molen had been extremely busy. On that first night he, Eugene, and Anise drank and chatted away until dawn. After the Demon King of Incarceration left, Molen spoke with knights from all around the world, starting with the Lionhearts, and attended several meetings with the other kings. He briefly observed the knights during their training and gave them similar sorts of advice, and he held a small banquet with the other Buyur tribesmen living in the fort. He also spent some time with Amun-Rur and the White Fangs. Then, even though he had already talked to most of them, he still came to visit the Lionhearts in their mansion so that he could personally meet all those who bore the last name Lionheart and tell them various stories. Molen was especially fond of Gilead and his twins. Although there wasn't much of a facial resemblance, Gilead's long hair seemed to remind Molen of Vermouth. The twins found it difficult to get over their jitters when they first met Molen, but even though it didn't really suit him, Molen acted like a kind grandfather to them and even gave them tips as the twins sparred. While at the fort, Molen hadn't gotten an ounce of sleep. It was all because of the Nur. Even though the 2 days he had spent at the fort had been so busy, Molen had continuously kept an eye on Lehanjar. No one knew when the Nur might reappear. 2 days before, it had seemed that the Nur had finally reappeared. But if that was all there was to it, then Eugene and Anise would have just accepted it as something that couldn't be helped. If Molen had come back that very morning, they would have just found him and cursed at him a few times. However, it had been 2 full days and Molen had yet to return to the fort. So in order to find Molen, Eugene and Anise had left to climb Lehanjar. In order to prevent anyone from worrying needlessly, Eugene had given some vague explanation to the Patriarch. He told Gilead that they were going to receive a test from the brave Molen at Lehanjar. It was a hastily made-up excuse, but being given a test by the great hero had held enough weight to convince the others. In fact, it's all because Molen is such an idiot, Eugene spat out as he glared down at the light flickering in the palm of his hand. Because that bastard put up such a tough act when all the knights were gathered together. Everyone thinks that doing stuff like this is just Molen being Molen. You're being too harsh on Molen. Anise's eyes widened as she stared at Eugene. Molen definitely acts like a fool when he's together with us, but in front of his descendants and the people from this era he got his act together pretty fine, no? Yeah, and he looked way too serious. They say that the position makes the person, and it seems like that really is the case, Eugene sighed. Hamel, you were already dead at the time so you might not be clear about this, but 300 years ago Molen really was quite amazing, Anise lectured him. Molen was the one who first settled in this unexplored frozen land at the northern end of the continent with just his own personal strength. At that time, the people of the continent were calling him the pioneering king of the north. But factually speaking, it's not like Molen did it all on his own, right? Eugene argued. I've heard that you also helped the founding of Rur by placing pressure on the Pope of Uras, no? Anise acknowledged his point. Sienna helped as well, and Sir Vermouth also provided a significant portion of Molin's pioneering funds. However, it was still all because of Molin's personal strength and firm will that he was able to settle in this land and establish a kingdom. This was just plain fact without any exaggeration. Eugene clicked his tongue as he glared at the flickering flames. In any case, they only allowed the two of us to come here and look for Molin without protesting because they thought that it was very much like Molin to give people this kind of task, Eugene insisted. It's a pretty reasonable pretext, Anise reminded him. The founder of Ruhr, the great hero from 300 years ago, has reappeared for the first time in 100 years. The living legend decides to test the hero and the saint of the present era. Doesn't it sound like something from a myth or a legend? And yet here we are actually looking for Molin after he disappeared on his own, Eugene grumbled. Unlike last time, they didn't require Abel's guidance. As they were leaving the Great Hammer Canyon last time, Eugene had left behind a magical beacon for the next time they came looking for Molin. The flame that Eugene was holding in the palm of his hand was leading the way as they searched for the magical beacon. Thanks to all of this, their movement speed had increased significantly. This was because last time they had come here, they had been forced to keep pace with Abel's speed, but now there wasn't any need for that. Eugene held his head high as he extinguished the flame held in his palm. At the very limits of his field of vision, the Great Hammer Canyon was wavering in the distance. There was still quite a distance before they could reach it, but if they kept up their current pace they would probably get there in half a day. The problem will be the barrier. What are we going to do about it? Anise asked. If I had taken the time to think about that, we wouldn't have gotten here this fast, no? Eugene pointed out. In that case, while we were making our way through that blizzard, we might have even crossed paths and not noticed as Molin returned to the fort ahead of us. If that really happened, then I'm going to sock Molin right in the kisser when I see him, Anise threatened. Eugene agreed. You go ahead and smash the front of his head, I'll take care of the back. Sounds good. Hamel, I'm going to head in for a bit, so take good care of Christina and keep her out of danger, Anise requested as she swapped places with Christina. Now standing in her spot, Christina blinked in surprise a few times before her brows furrowed and she shivered in the cold. Don't you think that you're going too far? Christina complained. What is it? Eugene asked. Christina clarified. I'm talking about Lady Anise. When it was just the two of them talking, Christina would always address Anise as sister. But using that form of address in front of other people was somehow embarrassing. What's the difference? I've already said this before, but between nuns there's nothing special about calling each other sister, is there? There was certainly nothing unusual about nuns calling each other sister, but when Christina used that word, Anise always interpreted it as Christina calling her big sis. Christina was well aware of this, so it made her embarrassed to call Anise sister in front of others. Christina aired her grievances. I can understand why she would ask to swap places with me when she has a lot that she wants to say. I can also understand why she left most of the walk through this cold and inhospitable land to me. But Lady Anise is being quite ill-mannered by removing all the miracles that prevent the cold from affecting us the moment that she swaps places with me. Anise admitted, It's fun for me to see you shivering in the cold. Also, this is all for your sake, Christina. Krisitna muttered, Just how in the world could this be for my sake? When you suddenly noticed how cold it was, wouldn't it have been nice if you had thrown yourself into Hamel's arms to escape the cold? Christina's lips, which had just been about to vent her overflowing displeasure, were left flapping soundlessly. That's what I was expecting you to do without even thinking about it, but now that we've said all this, you've missed the chance to do so. While this opportunity has turned out to be a failure, next time, you should focus on embracing Hamel. If you're hugging him because you're cold, then even if he's embarrassed, Hamel won't reject it. Why have you suddenly stopped talking when you were just about to say something? Eugene asked in concern. Christina's whole face blushed red as she stammered, a devil is whispering to me inside of my head. Though it had already passed the time when the sun would normally set, there was no night in Lahanjar. Eugene glared at the blizzard-strewn sky and the distant sunlight, as well as the towering hammer-shaped cliffs below. The last time they came here they pitched a tent nearby and camped here. However, there was no need to do so now. Neither Eugene nor Christina felt any need to rest. Seeing the Great Hammer Canyon from here, it gave off a completely different atmosphere from what they had felt the last time they were here. No, Rather, it was better said that the Great Hammer Canyon had been like this from the very beginning. The atmosphere at that time had been unusual. It had undergone a sudden transformation due to the appearance of the Nur. Currently, there was no feeling in the air like what they had felt the last time the Nur had appeared. They couldn't see any signs of that hideous monster, nor did they feel the ominous aura that so resembled the Demon King of Destruction. Eugene clicked his tongue and carried on walking from where he had paused. Already down by the cliffs, Eugene turned back to Christina and asked, "Do you need me to carry you down?" Christina hesitated for a moment, unable to give an immediate answer. During that pause, her eyes met the glowering stare of Mare through an opening in Eugene's cloak. Mare's gaze was so scornful and suspicious that for a few moments, Christina seriously considered accepting the offer to be carried, but eventually she rejected the offer. Ahem. I'll be fine. It was not that she wasn't fond of the idea, but she felt like she wouldn't be able to bear the embarrassment of being carried by Eugene. Especially since it was clear that the voice of Anise in her head would tease her enough to make her want to die. So Christina didn't have the confidence that she would be able to handle the teasing while keeping her composure. What would be so embarrassing about that? Anise complained. If you keep hesitating like this, you'll end up having a lot of things stolen from you. St stolen from me? Christina repeated questioningly. I can think of dozens of things that might be stolen away from you, but it would be far too embarrassing for me to have to say them with my own lips, one by one. Anise was teasing Christina again. However, this kind of teasing was causing Christina's imagination to run wild. As the snow continued to fall, the wind was freezing cold, but in spite of the chill breeze blowing into her face, Christina's face was burning hot. After she calmed her racing breath with a cough, she spread her wings of light. The top of the cliffs looked the same as last time. The only thing that could be seen was a lot of snow. There were no other traces. Eugene, who had been expecting at least a few bloodstains, was unable to hide his disappointment. What if they really had crossed paths with Molen without even noticing it? Apart from being pissed off in that case, Eugene and Anise would be forced to wait until Molen returned to come find them. He did say that he would be able to see Lehanjar even from a distance, Eugene recalled. For a few moments, Eugene was lost in thought as he paced the top of the cliffs. This place, the Great Hammer Canyon, acted as a kind of border, the frontier zone to which the Nur was limited when making its appearance into this world. The other side of the Lehanjar, where Molen had piled the corpses of the Nur, was also accessible from this point. This is too well hidden, Eugene judged. Asha, which granted its wielder comprehension of all magic, was already in Eugene's hands. However, it still wasn't easy for him to find the spells that had been hidden within this cliff. It reminded him of the darkroom. The spells there had been impossible for him to understand, but Eugene still remembered some of the magic formulas that had been used to create the darkroom. Mare, Eugene called out. I'm concentrating, came Mare's immediate reply from inside of the cloak. By linking her consciousness with Akasha, Mare was trying to interpret what spells there were in this location. Without any clues, it would have taken her a tremendous amount of time to interpret the spells in this whole area, but thankfully she wasn't completely clueless as she had obtained some information from their time in the darkroom. He really did hide it very deeply, Eugene muttered. Mare agreed. Yep, that's right. I don't really know what the Nur is, but you remember what Sir Molen said, right? The Nur emitted an ominous aura like a kind of poison. Even if it died, that ominous aura wouldn't disappear. Even an ordinary corpse could become the source of infectious diseases when it rotted, but if a massive ominous miasma like the Nur's corpse were to rot, and if those corpses had been piled up for 100 years, then Lehanjar would definitely have been unable to maintain its current appearance. The space here has been severed. Or perhaps quarantined is a better word. You also know what these spells are mostly used for, right? Mare reminded him. They're meant to keep things secret, Eugene silently replied. Yes, and it also has to be completely secure. It must be completely unnoticeable and impenetrable from both within and without. Thanks to the clues that we found between me and Akash, I think we can find it. However, I'm not sure if it's even possible for us to break into it, Mare said doubtfully. Eugene disagreed. It's not like we don't have any methods at all. Do you want to try and use that absurd sword? Mare asked in concern. They were talking about the moonlight sword. Well, if you use that thing, then I'm not really sure. It really might be possible to create an opening in this magical barrier that doesn't quite feel like ordinary magic. Mare mused. However, Sir Eugene, what are you going to do after that? Sir Moulin isn't a wizard. If this barrier is the result of the power that was granted to him by Sir Vermouth, that means it's one of kind. Once the barrier is broken by the Moonlight Sword, it might be impossible to repair the opening. I have no intention of actually breaking it, Eugene responded as laid his hands on the Moonlight Sword inside of his cloak. I'm just going to knock on the door a bit. If he's still on the inside, he'll see that there's something going on outside the barrier. If nothing happens and nobody reacts, that means Moulin is not inside. Or perhaps that idiot is just too dense to notice. Of course, there was also another possibility, but Eugene didn't really want to follow that train of thought. We've already come this far, but to be honest, I'm not sure about this, Christina suddenly confessed as she followed behind Eugene, who was still circling the tops of the cliffs. The sound of her voice came as a surprise, but Eugene immediately noticed that Anise had once again resumed control of their shared body. Because the two had swapped places in front of him so many times, Eugene had learned how to tell the subtle difference in accent between Anise and Christina. What are you so caught up on? Eugene questioned. Anise reminded him. Moulin said that he didn't want to show us what was on the other side because the poisonous aura there is so thick and because it might make your head strange. Then he said that it might even make us sick. He kept making up more excuses like that to keep us from looking. Moulin had kept trying to make up excuses despite absolutely sucking at it. That means there is something Moulin doesn't want us to see on the other side, Anise concluded. So what about it? Eugene snorted dismissively. Anise glared at him. Hamel, I knew that you would say something like that. You're really just as inconsiderate as you were 300 years ago. Eugene replied. Anise, you also saw that look in Moulin's eyes. Right here, when we first met Moulin, did you really forget what Moulin looked like at that moment? Moulin at that time really wasn't like the usual Moulin, Anise recalled. That's right, Moulin wasn't like himself, Eugene agreed. He drove us away with a ferocious swing of his axe. But after all that debacle, only a few days later he shows up smiling like a fool, dragging us into hugs and sobbing like a baby. Eugene didn't want to accept that the situation was suspicious, but at this point he had no other choice but to acknowledge it. He thus voiced his fears. It isn't that Moulin couldn't have changed over the past 300 years. He has definitely changed, but when he's in front of us he seems as if he hasn't changed at all. Perhaps he's hiding those changes for some reason. I don't know the reason, and it seems that Moulin doesn't want to talk about it, but since I'm a son of a bitch, I don't need to be considerate of Moulin. I need to see why Moulin is doing this with my own two eyes. Please don't call yourself a son of a bitch, Anise protested. But you called me a son of a bitch earlier, Eugene argued back. I said that you're no different from a son of a bitch. I didn't say that you were a son of a bitch, Anise corrected him. Also Hamel, if even you think that what you're currently trying to do makes you into a son of a bitch, even if it's just for your own sake, shouldn't you try not to be a son of a bitch? Eugene just smirked in response to this. In the end, Anise was spouting all these words and arguing that they should be considerate of Moulin's feelings, but she was still standing here and she hadn't actually refused to go over to the other side. After all, wasn't it Anise who had first pointed out the incongruity in Moulin's words a few days ago? The thing that you don't want us to see over there isn't just random stuff like some monster corpses. Also, I am still the same old me. The more you don't want to show me something, the more I want to see it, regardless of the cost. Anise Slywood really was this kind of terrible person. In fact, Anise wasn't the only one. Eugene was the same type of person, and if Sienna had been here as well, Sienna would have also behaved in the same fashion. The party had gone through all sorts of things together. They had almost died over and over again. They had spent dozens of years wandering around together like that. Their journey through Helmuth had changed each of them in various ways. However, there were some things that hadn't changed. If Moulin really had changed, if he had been left with no choice but to change during these long 300 years, and if Moulin had been forced to change during the 100 years he had spent blocking the Nur's escape, then Hamel and Anise needed to find out the reason for this. It's here, Eugene called out as his steps halted. Within the cloak, Mare was gasping for breath. It was only natural for her to do so, as she almost had to overload herself in order to interpret the spells layered over this space. Eugene stuck his hand into his cloak and patted Mare on the head a few times. Don't think that you can end things with just that, Mare warned him. Next time, you need to take me to ride on the merry-go-round. Merry-go-round? Eugene repeated in confusion. Mare pouted. Sir Eugene, you often show a strange reaction to the words merry-go-round. Could it be that you're embarrassed of riding on a merry-go-round with me? It's not embarrassing, but something is a bit off, Eugene muttered awkwardly as he removed his hand from Mare's head and pulled out the moonlight sword. The moonlight sword. Anis's expression stiffened slightly as she said its name. The sword had kept the same appearance as it had 300 years ago, but just by looking at it, Anis could feel her heart begin to pound. Even though it had been shattered, leaving behind only the hilt and fragments of the blade, the strangely ominous aura that the sword emitted still remained. At first glance, it seemed to be just a part of an ordinary sword, something that could have been sold by just about any blacksmith's workshop. Eugene held the sword by its scabbard and slowly pulled the hilt as if drawing the blade out. Fwoosh! Pale moonlight flickered, forming the blade. As ever, Anis just couldn't get used to the sight of that light. Eugene was similarly unable to get used to the light of the moonlight sword. Its ominous aura was different from that of the Demon King of Destruction. It was refined, yet somehow still turbulent. Destruction in the form of a sword. The blade of light flickered within Eugene's grasp. He had no intention of breaking the barrier. All he wanted to do was knock on it slightly. It was possible for him to adjust the power of the sword to that extent. With that thought in mind, Eugene lifted the moonlight sword. However, it turned out that there was no need for him to knock. The moment that the moonlight sword fell toward the barrier, as if responding to its light, the barrier opened up wide. Though opening up the way to the dimension on the other side wasn't like opening an actual physical door. There wasn't any floating feeling either. As if the world around them had just decided to change on its own, Eugene and Anis were suddenly standing in a different location. What did you do? Anis asked hesitantly. Eugene denied his involvement. No, I didn't do anything. The barrier just opened up on its own. Could it be that Molan had felt something in advance? Or perhaps Vermouth's barrier had responded to the moonlight sword and opened up the door. Right now, Eugene didn't know the answer to these questions. Ugh. Anis suddenly gagged and clasped her hand across her mouth. 300 years ago, they had seen so many terrible sights that they had almost gotten bored of them. However, no matter how experienced Anis herself was in Christina's body, which had no tolerance for such things, her first reaction to the sight in front of them was a violent rejection. The same went for Eugene as well. He felt dizzy and had to grab hold of his own knees to stop himself from falling over. This place was still in Lahanjar, the other side of the Great Hammer Canyon. However, there were no similarities to the world beyond. There wasn't even any snow on the ground and no snow was falling from the sky either. Whether it was the ground beneath their feet or the ice-stinging landscape around them, everything seemed bizarrely distorted. This scenery reminded Eugene of Helmuth from 300 years ago. In the Devil Dome, it was nothing strange for just about anything to occur. It was a hideous and grotesque land that, to any of the humans caught there, was no different from hell. Boom boom. They could see the winding and twisting peaks of the mountains above. The churned-up ground that seemed to have been created as lava boiled up from below the surface and then cooled down, was covered in blood and bits of flesh. Boom boom. A corpse was on the ground not far from where they stood. The body was familiar to Eugene. Just like the one he had seen a few days ago, it was a corpse of the monkey like the Nur. But this corpse was a far more ghastly sight. At that time, the corpse of the Nur that they found had been killed cleanly and lay on the ground with its throat slit. By contrast, this corpse was not lying on the ground, but rather strewn across the ground, ripped into pieces. Boom, boom. From somewhere in the distance and far above, loud and heavy crashing sounds echoed. Chapter 242. The Brave Molan 2. Eugene and Anis stood quietly in front of the Nur's corpse for a few moments. Just why had the body been left in this state? The two had the same suspicion in their heads, but they couldn't bear to voice their thoughts out loud. Instead, they just took a few moments to sort out their emotions. The crashing sound could still be heard intermittently. Afraid to stick her head out of the cloak, Mare just curled up inside of the cloak. Under the usual circumstances, Eugene would have patted Mare on the head or held her hand so that she wouldn't be so anxious, but right now he simply couldn't bring himself to do it. He was feeling anxious himself and he really didn't have the attention to spare for comforting her. After standing there absent-mindedly for some time, Eugene clicked his tongue and shook his head. Idiot, he cursed. He didn't want to think about it, but he couldn't help it. Eugene walked past the nurse corpse. Anise also let out a quiet sigh and followed behind him. It was difficult to walk across the ground that rose and fell in waves as if flowing lava had seemingly hardened in place. Some places were hard enough to walk over, but other places were not as sturdy, and their feet would sink into the ground when they crossed those areas. In addition, Reincarnted was a snowy mountain and snow was naturally falling on its other side. But here there was not even a trace of snow, much less a wintry landscape. Instead, everything here looked like a toddler's haphazard finger painting. Bizarre shapes with no coherent patterns formed the landscape. Eugene and Anise were very familiar with this kind of environment. At this point in time, Helmuth was considered one of the empires. It was a normal country that accepted immigrants from all over the continent, and had lost all traces of its former appearance from 300 years ago. The Helmuth of the past, however, had been a terrible sight worthy of being called hell. This reminds me of the old days, Eugene muttered as he climbed up the curved slope. Do you miss those days? Anise asked from behind him. To be honest, it would be a lie to say that I didn't miss them, Eugene admitted. Back then I was still alive and hadn't died yet, and you were also alive at that time. Anise laughed wryly and nodded. She glanced down at the lump of flesh by her feet. It was a fragment of a corpse that had been shredded to such minute bits that it was impossible to imagine what it originally looked like. Similar bits of flesh were scattered all across their field of view. Someone had dragged the corpse here, randomly knocking it against whatever was in the way, then had torn it apart with grip strength alone before throwing the pieces away. While it was impossible to imagine the original appearance of the corpse, it was possible for them to picture why the corpse had become like this. Eugene looked at the intestines hanging from a twisted tree. Were they already rotten? He couldn't really tell. The smell was foul and the colors were odd, so they definitely seemed to be rotten. Or perhaps it was that the nurse's internal organs looked like that to begin with. Eugene wondered if that was even important. This place was more like a garbage dump than a grave, so it was more accurate to say that the shredded corpses here had been thrown away like garbage instead of being enshrined within a tomb. Besides the lumps of flesh, guts, blood, and bones, there were several other traces visible. There were clear scratch marks on the cliffs and rocks. At least, it was clear that they had been intentionally made, though it was hard to tell if they were meant to be pictures or words. Among all these traces, the ones that were most common and most prominent were the traces of violence seemingly left by something thrashing about and randomly destroying whatever was around them. Eugene and Anise walked past these traces, continuing to climb upward. The higher they got, the more violent, obvious, and frequent these traces grew. It was as if the one who left them behind wanted to make sure that no one would climb up this mountain. Or perhaps they didn't want anything up there to come back down. Idiot. This time it was Anise, not Eugene, who muttered this word. She stepped forward herself and swung her flail to topple the rubble blocking them. Boom boom. The sound was no longer coming from so far away. Eugene tucked the moonlight sword, which he had been holding in his hand, back into his cloak. For a moment he hesitated. Should he pull something else out and keep it at the ready? He thought about it for a second. Was there really a reason for why he needed to have a weapon in his hand? In the end he decided not to worry about it. He didn't pull out another weapon and he didn't even clench his fists. Anise, who now followed behind him once more, also hung the flail that she was holding back at her waist. Instead, both of her hands reached up to clutch the rosary hanging around her neck. In a low voice, Anise began to recite a prayer. Boom boom. The sound was now coming from right ahead of them. A few moments later, Molin came into view. He looked just like what they had imagined he would from the moment that they had entered this side of the Reincarnted and had first heard those thunderous blasts. Molin was sitting on his knees with both hands gripping the ground, and he was smashing his own head into the ground. Every time this happened, the ground shook as if an earthquake had occurred. Inside the cloak, Mare swallowed back a gasp. Eugene and Anise didn't show any immediate reaction. While they were climbing up here. No, from the moment Molin had revealed that there was something here that he didn't want to show them, they had suspected that they might see something like this. Eugene and Anise were all too familiar with Molin. From 300 years ago until now, Molin had always been a brave warrior who would never back down from a challenge. Someone else instead would have entertained the thought of just collapsing and giving in to despair when faced with such a duty, but they couldn't even imagine the sight of Molin quitting like that. Molin had always stood at the forefront of the battlefield. He took that as his duty, and everyone entrusted the vanguard to Molan as if it was only natural. And truly in those days it was the natural thing to do. Because Molan was brave and he never backed down. He was a true warrior who was strong and would never falter. "Hey," Eugene called out to Molan in a quiet voice. Eugene hadn't directly experienced the 300 years that had passed since they had last met. The same went for Anise. Anise had died and become an angel, but following her death she had spent most of that time asleep. Thus, the two had never experienced what a long and terrible period of time 300 years could be for a human being. However, it was different for Molan. He had lived for those whole 300 years. Apart from himself, all of his comrades had died, and after they had disappeared he had endured all that time alone. He had the opportunity to choose to die in peace and happiness, with everyone's blessings for all that he had done. Yet Molan hadn't made that choice. It was not that he was unwilling to die. No, Molan wanted to die, but he wanted a warrior's death. In his view, all of his friends had died as warriors and he desired the same for himself. Then, Vermouth had entrusted this mission to Molan just as the latter was caught in this distress. Naturally, Molan had happily accepted the mission. For over 100 years, he alone had blocked the appearance of this race of ominous monsters whose origin was impossible to confirm. He had issued an edict to prevent anyone from crossing the Great Hamer Canyon and climbing to the peak of the snowy mountain. This was out of concern that people would encounter the Nur, as it was practically impossible to predict when and where they would reappear. Thus, Molan had to keep permanent watch over this barren wasteland at the end of the world. Molan was strong. He was brave. He never backed down and he never despaired. He would never collapse. But he could still be worn down. The weight of his hundreds of years had ground away at Molan's mental strength. His body was still as strong as ever, but there were hundreds and thousands of corpses piled up in this place and all of the corpses were emitting poisonous aura. In addition, having to watch from the side as all of his beloved and dependable comrades, as well as his descendants, left this world, leaving him all alone, had gnawed away at Molan from the inside. Now his deceased comrades had reappeared in front of Molan. Their appearances were different from what they had looked like hundreds of years before, but Molan was still able to recognize them. Eugene didn't know if Molan still personally thought of himself as the same brave Molan that he had been 300 years before. However, now that he was able to reunite with his deceased comrades, Molan had probably decided that he wanted everyone to be able to address him the same as they had back in the day, and see him as the same great figure that they remembered rather than as a pitiful, ruined version of himself. The Molan that Eugene remembered was just that type of fool. An idiot who didn't know how to use tricks and complicated things like that, and could only think in a barbaric and simple way. As such, Eugene couldn't help but call Molan a fool once more. "Hey, idiot." The booming noises suddenly stopped. The figure of Molan, who had been pounding his head against the ground like a machine, froze in place. Molan raised his head from the deep crater that he had dug. He didn't turn to look behind him immediately. Instead, he stayed like that for a few moments, then slowly turned his head. "I didn't want to show you this side of me," Molan said as he stood up. His back was still turned toward them. Eugene stared at the bulging muscles that lined Molan's back. His skin was flawless, with not a single scar. Molan's back, so tall and broad usually, looked strangely small now. "So what?" Eugene scoffed. "It was only a question of sooner or later. Eventually we would have found you like this. Have you forgotten about it? You agreed to show us this place once the night march was over." Molan argued back. "What I promised to show you was this place, not me acting like this. Have you forgotten what I said?" Anise spoke up, her voice trembling slightly at first. However, she soon caught hold of her emotions and forced out her usual smile. "Molan, didn't I say that if there's something that you definitely didn't want to show me, that would only make me want to see it all the more, no matter what the cost may be? From the time that I was born to the time that I died, I haven't had many wishes that came true, but thanks to you, I've been able to enjoy such a rare experience." It wasn't that Anise couldn't imagine Molan being in such a state. As the saint, she had healed and saved countless people. In the process, she had seen countless people die in front of her without being able to do anything, and right at the very end she hadn't even been able to save herself. Thus, Anise was well aware of how people could break down and collapse. She had faced the option of giving in to despair and running away from everything. But in the end she had been unable to run away. Things like her beliefs and her duty had held her back like a curse at her very last moment. Anise didn't regret dying like that, however. In the end, she had been able to choose death rather than being forced into it. However, Molen was different. He wasn't able to choose death. No one else could help him, nor could they save him. If your head was injured even a little, then I could at least heal you. But your head is so damn tough, Molen. I know you don't even have a scratch. Well, it's kinda nice not having anything to do. Anise sympathized with Molen. Her heart ached for him and it felt like she might even cry. However, she definitely couldn't allow herself to reveal these feelings. She felt like Molen wouldn't want to see her like that, and Anise herself didn't want to behave like that. You too, Molen said as he chuckled. After staring blankly up at the sky for a few moments, Molen slowly turned around, and they were finally able to see his face. It was just as Anise had said. Even though he had slammed his face into the ground hard enough that the very mountain itself had been shaken by the force, Molen's forehead bore not a single scratch, let alone any injury or blood. While he was physically intact, however, his expression said something completely different about his mental state. The impression that Molen had given off when they had seen him just a few days before was that he was the same Molen that they had known in the old days, but the man they were seeing in front of their eyes. This man was the same as he had been when they had first reunited in the Great Hammer Canyon. His eyes were cold, without any trace of emotion. Eyes that seemed to have been hollowed out by the years. Just like the eyes of Vermouth in the darkroom, tired, cloudy, dull. You haven't changed. You're just like you were in the old days, Molen muttered at Eugene and Anise, looking at them with those lifeless eyes. At these words, Eugene snorted and shook his head. It's because we've both died once. That goes for me especially since I died the earliest. It's only natural that I haven't changed. That goes for me as well, Anise agreed. My life was also quite tragic, but I was still able to take my life after doing all the things that I wanted to do and drinking to my heart's content. Molen trailed off with a light. I tried my best not to change. I thought that I couldn't allow myself to do so. However, against my own will, I couldn't help but to change slowly. Eugene pointed out, 300 years is a long time for a human being. I know, Molen sighed. 300 years is a really long time. However, I still didn't want to change. I told myself that I couldn't, and I believed that I would only be able to fulfill my mission by maintaining a clear state of self. A few days ago. Is it because of Vermouth's request that you are unable to die? When Eugene had asked that question, Molen had replied with a smile. I won't die because I don't want to. As a warrior, I need to live a worthy life. While following the request of an old friend, I am protecting the snowy mountains and the snowfield that I love, the country that I created with my own hand, and even the whole world. I don't want to die an unsightly death from old age. I want to die as a warrior, as a hero. Currently, death seems like a distant thing to me, but if I eventually lose strength and end up dying, I must not fall, Molen stated. The corpses of the Nur that I have piled up until this point will act as proof of my life as a warrior and a hero. Molen proudly declared, this is the mission that Vermouth entrusted to me. As the only one of us left alive, I accepted his request. Vermouth had made the request and Molen had chosen to accept it. Because this was what Molen wanted. Molen did not resent Vermouth. Vermouth hadn't given him any explanation. He hadn't said what the Nur were, nor why they kept reappearing. He hadn't even explained why he was asking for this favor. Yet Molen still didn't resent Vermouth. It was because he knew full well that the only one Vermouth could trust with this sort of task was the brave Molen. I'm fine, Molen said after a vigorous shake of his head. I'm just a little dizzy. As you may have already sensed, the Nur's miasma is hellish. It's impossible to get used to it. Especially for me since I've killed so many of them over such a long period of time. As such, there are times when I can't control all of the things inside me. So what? Since you can't control yourself, you're trying to solve your problems like that? Eugene asked sarcastically. I know that it's embarrassing and ugly. I'm all too aware that such behavior does not befit a warrior, so I didn't want to show you this. The more I thought about it, the angrier I grew with myself. That's why I was smashing my own head into the ground, Moon shamefacedly confessed. Idiot. Do you really think that you can let go of your anger by smashing your head into the ground? Eugene muttered as he clenched and unclenched his fists. At these words, Molen could only grin. Hamel, Anise, Molen spoke up after a short silence. Like his weary eyes, his voice sounded just as worn out as he continued. Isn't it enough now? What do you mean? Eugene demanded. Hamel, you said that you wanted to see this place. Anise, you also said that you wanted to see the thing that I didn't want to show anyone. In the end, you've seen all that you wanted to see, Molen reminded them. Eugene noticed that Molen's fingertips were trembling slightly. Molen attempted to persuade them. I don't know how you got in here. Even if I make you leave, you might be able to come back in. But please don't. I still need some time to calm down properly. I don't want you to see me in that state any longer. Molen could feel Eugene's gaze. He cupped his trembling hands together to hide the shaking and turned back around. Go back to Fort Lehane. There's a chance that the Nur might reappear once more. I will return in 2 days, Molen promised. And what if the Nur doesn't reappear during those 2 days? Eugene retorted. Will you keep banging your head on the floor like you were before? Molen defended himself. It's not like it's really all that painful for me to do so. I suppose so, Eugene agreed sarcastically. Your body is uselessly tough, and if your body breaks down because of excessive self-injury, then you won't be able to continue fulfilling Vermouth's request. I'm not just doing this because of Vermouth's request, Hamel. Like I said before, any one of us would do the same thing that I am, Molen argued back. I know. There's no way that you can just leave a monster like the Nur or whatever to its own devices, so even if it were me in your place, I would have lived here in order to keep killing the Nur. Then, when I finally thought that I couldn't continue doing this any longer, I would have killed myself, Eugene stated without any hesitation. That wouldn't have happened, Hamel. You weren't such a weak warrior. None of us would have ever committed suicide without fulfilling our mission. Then I would just gone crazy and broken down, Eugene muttered as he stared at Molen. Just like you have. I'm not crazy, Molen denied it. I'm not broken either. I'm just having trouble keeping calm. I hope that is the case. For you, it must have been a very long time ago, but the battlefield that we fought on. Eugene smirked as he kicked something in front of him. Pow! A crumpled Nur's head was sent flying by Eugene's kick. It was full of monsters that were much worse than this one. If you were caught up with dealing with a guy like this for over 100 years, then someone like you, who's barbaric by nature and overflowing with strength, would never be satisfied with just that. It might get your blood boiling, but it wouldn't be enough to calm you back down. Anise attempted to intervene. Hamel, Molen is. Be quiet, Anise, Eugene cut her off. In the face of Eugene's sharp gaze, Anise just sighed and took a few steps back. Idiots, Anise muttered. Don't include me in that, Eugene replied with a laugh. Eugene put his right hand inside of his cloak and raised his gaze to look up the mountain. There was still some more distance that they could climb. Hey Molen, I want to take a look at the peak of this mountain, Eugene suggested. There's nothing there, Molen informed him. The view isn't worth much either. That's for me to judge. Hamel. Eugene changed the subject. Come to think of it, your descendant told me quite an interesting story. Back in Hamilon, the capital of Ruhr, Amon-Ruhr had dropped them in front of the statue of Hamel and Molen, then said something to Eugene with a smirk. Recalling that moment, Eugene said, I've heard that you said it yourself. That 300 years ago, you were the strongest of Vermouth's comrades. In other words, you were saying that you were stronger than me. Hamel, Molen called out calmly. Eugene continued unimpeded. Come to think of it, I'm also very curious. While traveling around with Vermouth, I faced him a few times, but I've never had a proper match with you. Molen turned his head around once more to look at Eugene. Also, Anise showed me something interesting, Eugene added. He was talking about the dream that he had been shown through the holy sword in the Samar rainforest. You said something while weeping on my grave, didn't you? You said that you wanted to fight with me someday. You wanted to know between you and me who was the greater warrior, right? Eugene pressed Molen. Molen hesitantly tried to defuse the situation. I don't need to fight with you, Hamel. I know you very well. I recognize your ability. You're greater, braver, and stronger. Do you really think that? Eugene asked while tilting his head to the side. Unable to reply, Molen just glared at Eugene. Seeing this gaze, Eugene smiled and nodded. Your eyes tell me that you don't really think that, Eugene observed as his hand inside of his cloak grabbed onto Akasha. Molen warned him, don't do anything foolish, Hamel. He would have thought that such words would ever come from your lips. Eugene sarcastically marveled as his white flame formula emitted sparks of purple flames. As Molen saw this appearance, he clenched his fists. Eugene saw a faint light beginning to flicker within Molin's eyes. He promised, I won't use any weapons because you're a friend after all. Hamel. Molin shouted in alarm. However, I will use magic. Since your skills aren't the same as they were in my past life, it should be fine for me to use the magic that I wasn't able to use back then, Eugene justified himself. With Akasha, Eugene began to prepare his signature. Anise, who had already backed off into the distance, shook her head. Idiots.